Hey y'all, this is Darren Van Dam, and you are watching Flick Connection, the show that connects you with the best movies to stream, and today we're talking about 10 incredible movies you can catch for free right here on YouTube. So if you don't know, not only can you rent movies right here on YouTube, they also have a selection of free movies. Now they will have ads unless you're paying for YouTube Premium, but they're YouTube ads and they don't interrupt the movie too much. As usual, the full list of all the movies discussed here can be found in the top pinned comment down below, but unlike usual, I've linked directly to all of these movies, so you can start watching them right away. Keep in mind though, availability will change with time, so if you're not already subscribed, go ahead and click that subscribe button. That way you get notified when these videos release and you don't miss the movies before they're gone. But my number 10 pick on this list is actually a little known vampire movie titled Hunted. And yes, this is a teenage vampire movie, but there's something interesting about Hunted that sets it apart from movies like Twilight. I should point out this movie also goes by the title Rufus. You may see it as that in some regions, but here in the US it's titled Hunted. And while the basic plot does sound like something made for teenagers, Hunted actually has a harder edge to it. This is not a gore fest of a movie or anything like that, but it does feel a bit more raw and realistic than teenage vampires typically do, which is what sets this one apart. While it is dark, it's not overly dark, it's not overly sappy either, which is what you usually get with these teenage vampire flicks. So do not let that dissuade you. This is actually a really interesting vampire flick. Now, Kevin Costner is probably most famous for Dances with Wolves. Not only did he star in that, but he directed it, bunch of Oscars, the whole thing. It's a fantastic Western, but he did another one years later that was almost as good, but has been forgotten with time, Open Range. He stars in this as well, alongside Robert Duvall, and this does have a slow pace to it, but luckily, these slow bits are all beautifully shot. They shot this movie out on location, and it is an amazing looking Western, especially for something to have come out in the early 2000s, a time when we didn't get many Westerns. This is easily one of the best from that decade. And even though this is not an all-out action movie, it's a lot more interpersonal dramas and things, and the story unfolds, again, quite slowly. There is an epic shootout towards the end of this movie that rivals the shootouts in Tombstone. Seriously. And that's not the only reason to watch the movie, but those sequences are absolutely fantastic. But again, leading up to that, you get a pretty solid Western with an amazing performance from Robert Duvall. There's also a bunch of fantastic character actors in this doing really great Western work. So if it's been a while since you've seen a solid Western, they don't get a whole lot more solid than Open Range. There's better ones, but again, they don't get much more solid than this. My number 8 pick will change things up a bit with one for the whole family, but it's a fairly recent release from the Aardman Animation Group, which is one of my favorite animation companies working today. They're responsible for projects like Wallace and Gromit and Chicken Run, and Early Man is one of their more recent movies, and it's absolutely hysterical. This is done in a beautiful stop-motion animation style. You follow a group of cavemen that discover the sport of football, or soccer, as we put it here in the US. Then they run into some characters from the Bronze Age, and they have a soccer match, and it's all really funny stuff. The setup here is not great for people who don't care anything about soccer or football, but the comedy that they squeeze into these movies is absolutely fantastic. Comedy-wise, I think Aardman rivals Pixar. In fact, I'll say Aardman projects are now funnier than anything Pixar puts out. I think that studio's lost a bit of its sense of humor. Aardman has not. There's obviously a lot of historical humor here, but there's also a lot of really silly stuff that the kids can laugh at as well. I'm telling you, this list has got some killer flicks on it. My next pick is what I consider to be one of Christopher Nolan's most underappreciated movies, The Prestige. Now, I know a lot of people do love this movie, yet it's just not really spoken about much when people talk about Christopher Nolan movies for some reason. This was released between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, and has a killer cast with Christian Bale, Hugh Jackman, Michael Caine, and Scarlett Johansson. This takes place in the 1890s and features two rival magicians, played by Bale and Jackman, trying to one-up each other with the ultimate illusion. Nothing too grand there, but it's Christopher Nolan and it goes into some wild directions, including a short but amazing performance from David Bowie as Nikola Tesla. It's got all the twists and turns you would come to expect from a Christopher Nolan movie, except I think the main point here in The Prestige, the final thought you're left with, hits harder and is more poignant than it often is in Christopher Nolan movies. Okay, my next pick on this list comes from 1964. It's a black and white film from a legendary director. However, the reason it makes this list and the reason it makes this place on the list is because Dr. Strangelove is eerily relevant to watch today. Now, ultimately, what happens in Dr. Strangelove is all really silly, yet the things that put all of this craziness into motion are pretty simple and really probably could have happened or could happen in the future if we're not careful. But the main thing to focus on with Dr. Strangelove is the banter, all of the dialogue, the doublespeak, the back and forth. Things like,
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Absurdity that I think most of us can agree is still present in politics, in culture. It permeates everything, and Dr. Strangelove sort of distilled it and captured it in this really beautiful way. And it's Stanley Kubrick, so every shot is framed up really well. It's just a joy to watch. Again, even for something with this many years on it, it's just surprisingly relevant here in 2022. Okay, my next pick on this list is a personal favorite of mine. It's one of my favorite little hidden gems to recommend because it's such a good movie with such an amazing performance from an incredible actor that far too few people know about. I'm talking about Anthony Hopkins in The World's Fastest Indian. This is the true story of Burt Munro, a man from New Zealand who wanted to set a land speed record on a modified Indian motorcycle. So he goes on this trip around the world to the salt flats in the US, and it's a fantastic story. Even if you're not into cars, you're not into racing, none of that matters. Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of this really interesting Burt Munro character sets this movie off, and then it turns into a fantastic road movie. He goes in and out of people's lives. You get these great little performances from some fantastic actors that are only in the movie for about 5 minutes or so. And again, even if you're not into the racing aspect, which is great in this movie, by the way, but if you're not into that, all of the relationships that he develops, he's this really strange character that people are not sure about at first, but everybody kind of comes around to love. That's kind of an amazing thing to watch in this movie, and the movie itself has a lot of heart. It's incredibly well directed and is a real joy to watch. If you've never seen it, it is a little bit long-winded, but it's well worth it. It's an amazing watch. All right, my number 4 pick is another one for the kids, but hang with me because my number 3 pick is definitely not. I will say though, I consider The Iron Giant to be one of the best family movies to have come out in the last 25 years or so. And I say that because this movie holds up today. It's actually one of the last hand-drawn animated movies that is still watched, loved, and has a place in like modern day pop culture. There's a beautiful sort of vintage animation style here, and this was directed by Brad Bird, who would go on to direct The Incredibles and the 4th Mission Impossible movie, both really kind of fun, bombastic action movies that are glued together really well. The Iron Giant kind of falls into the same boat. While there is not a ton of action in it, when there is, it's all directed really well, and the story really shines through with The Iron Giant in a fantastic way. I would consider this to be required viewing for young audiences. If you have kids that have not seen this, I promise you, you could put this on. Not only will they love it, they'll have no idea they're watching a movie that's almost a quarter century old. But then my number 3 pick is what I consider to be one of the greatest horror movies ever made, Poltergeist. Now, I know this isn't necessarily the scariest horror movie ever made, but it is one of the more interesting ones and one that has held up over time. In fact, I would maybe put this in like all-time top 10 horror movies along with movies like The Shining and The Exorcist. And I think a lot of people mistakenly think this was directed by Steven Spielberg. He wrote and produced it, and he's even got a little bit of a cameo in it, yet he did not direct this. This was actually directed by Tobe Hooper, who is most famous for having directed the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And while he did do some other movies that I do recommend, I would say those are easily his top 2, and damned if he doesn't have 2 in probably the top 10 horror movies of all time. And whereas the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is dark, grungy, and dirty, Poltergeist is kind of clean and glossy. This movie is also filled to the brim with practical effects. Keep in mind, this was released in 1982, before computer effects were in movies, and while it does take a little bit of time for the effects to start kicking in, once they start happening in Poltergeist, they literally do not stop. This movie turns into a visual feast of a horror movie. If it's been a while since you've seen Poltergeist, I promise you've forgotten how many amazing moments are crammed in to one horror movie. My number 2 pick comes from one of my least favorite movies from one of my favorite movie franchises of all time, Mad Max. Now, I am not hating on the original, I just happen to think that George Miller has only improved this concept with every iteration he's made. There have been 4 so far, and Mad Max, the original, is a solid flick that all the others are built on. This was released in 1979 and takes place in sort of a dystopian future where bandits are running all over the road and there's sort of this elite police force. In fact, Mad Max doesn't really occur after a major apocalyptic event like the subsequent films would. This looks like it's just at the collapse of civilization, where government's falling apart, crime is rampant, that sort of thing. And I will say Mad Max does take quite a while to take off, but once it does, it's got some fantastic sequences in it, and it fits along with all the other movies in this beautiful way where each one is very, very different, and not just story-wise. I mean, even aesthetically and the way that the apocalypse is depicted differs quite a bit from movie to movie. And even though Mad Max is not my favorite one in the franchise, it's still a solid flick that deserves the number 2 spot on a list of bangers. And then my number 1 pick, granted, is not for everybody, but it's from one of my favorite sci-fi writers working today, Alex Garland. His name has come up several times on recent lists, but today I'm talking about Annihilation.
Can you describe its form?
No.
Now, if you've seen this movie, hang with me for just a minute because Annihilation has a lot more depth to it than you might have realized on the first viewing. I know I didn't quite realize on the first viewing. It took quite a bit to realize what was actually going on, and what's so great about the way Alex Garland writes is he gives you everything you need to know in the movie. He just does it in a way where you're not gonna grab all of it on the first viewing. You need some of that information you get at the end of the movie to piece together with things you get along the way, and Annihilation does a beautiful job with this. Now, while I love the aesthetics, some of the performances, Oscar Isaac is great in this, obviously Natalie Portman, there's some horror elements that kind of come and go, but the climax of this movie is a wild one. In fact, when I was watching it, it reminded me a lot of 2001: A Space Odyssey. However, unlike 2001: A Space Odyssey, I think there's a much more solid reason as to why things are so strange towards the end of this movie, and I do think there's a lot more answers, whereas 2001: A Space Odyssey was about the fact that the answers are beyond our comprehension, but because it is a puzzle that can be solved, I absolutely love it for that. Check it out again if it's been a while since you've seen it, but that is the list. If you want more recommendations, you can go check out DarrenVanDam.com. I put recommendations right there on the homepage, as well as access to old videos, so you will literally never run out of good movies to watch, but I will keep making these episodes as long as you keep watching them. Thanks for checking out this special YouTube list, and you will see me on the next one.